I learned a thing or two about the National Annex in that simplified explanation. So today we're really focusing around the standard and the annex, and I'm very pleased to introduce Paul Shillcock, who's going to carry us today in terms of knowledge transfer and introduce us to some of these concepts. Paul is a top expert on enhancing business processes. He's based in the UK and is involved with helping all of us manage information effectively across asset life cycles, and is a big advocate for building information modeling according to ISO 19650. At Operam, Paul's company, Paul lends his vast knowledge to offer strategic guidance to governments and organizations around the world, helping them adhere to the latest industry standards. He's also behind Operam Academy, which I've attended and completed the course, and it's brilliant, where he creates innovative learning tools that bolster teams' abilities to manage information. Paul plays a vital role in various international industry and government initiatives and has significantly contributed to both national and international standards. He is notably the author of 19650-2 and its UK National Annex, and is a co-author of PAS 1192-2 and PD 19650. You weren't expecting that, Paul, but I thought I had to do that. So please join me in welcoming Paul to the front. Paul.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Sunny Banani. I hope that means doesn't mean my dog's dead or anything like that. Yeah, thanks, Richard. Thanks for the long introduction. Yeah, no, it's great to be here. Thank you very much for inviting us along. We've got this today, as Richard said, it's going to be quite full-on afternoon. So yeah, it's not all just about sitting there and entertaining, but hopefully you'll get as much out of it as you put into it as well. Okay, before we start, I'd just like to get a little bit of a feel for the room. Obviously, I have been to South Africa before, but it's still, I'm sure it's changed a little bit since I was here a few years ago. So what I'd like to do is just to get a feel for where your sort of level of understanding or knowledge is around ISO 19650. So could I ask you all just to maybe stand up for me, please? All right, and we'll do a quick little bit quiz. All right, so I'm going to ask you some questions. If the answer to the question is yes, you stay standing. If the answer to the question is no, then you sit down. Okay, so first question. Does everybody understand what we're about to do?
It's not good.
No one's, oh, okay, cool, right, okay, so second question. Before you came here today, had you ever heard of ISO 19650? Wow, okay. Second question, have you ever or do you have access to ISO 19650? Okay, a few people sitting down, all right. It is quite expensive, to be fair, and I don't get any money from it, by the way. Okay, now it's the big one. Have you actually read ISO 19650? Yeah, okay. Thank you for being honest, all right. So you've all got access, but you thought, nah, I don't need to read that. Perfect. Okay, so we've still got quite a few people standing. So obviously you've heard of it, you've got access to it, and you've read it. So final question. You can tell me what clause 5.5 of ISO 19650 Part 2 is. Oh, what? No way. All right, okay. It's mobilization, by the way. Okay, well, that sort of ties in nicely to what was my light reading on the plane over, which is the white paper done by the BIM Community Africa. So I was really pleased to see this, a nice big red line against ISO 19650. Obviously, there's other standards available to choose, obviously not as good, but obviously it's starting to get a little bit more traction across. So nearly 70% are either sort of looking at using it or using it within South Africa, which is fantastic. I did, when I was reading this on the way over, there was just a few things that I picked up, and I might just sort of give you an idea about where I'm coming from. So the first one was this about BIM standards to include ISO 19650. So for me, personally, I don't regard ISO 19650 as a BIM standard, okay? The standard is about information management. So it's an information management standard which sits alongside your asset management standard, so ISO 55000, design management, construction management, and all the other sort of management functions around there. If you look at the title is the management of information when using building information modeling, okay, or BIM. All right, so it's not, for me, it's not necessarily a BIM standard. The other thing I picked up is in terms of the objective. Now, we do tend to get fixated on the standards, all right, as if they're this sort of silver bullet, and if you just quote the number, then something magical is going to happen. The standard themselves, for me, the primary objective is to define the information management process, all right, and that's the process that you can see up on the wall around the room. The magic happens when you actually implement the process. Okay, so all those benefits that are being listed, that's what happens when you actually adopt and implement the process. So the standards themselves just define that process. The other one is around managing BIM data. Now, you won't find many references to BIM in the actual standards themselves. I think generally, as a rule, as an industry, we're trying to move away from this term BIM in the sense that it sort of served its purpose. For me, the standards and the management of information is about information relating to assets. Okay, it is asset information at the end of the day of what we're trying to generate, produce, manage, and use. All right. For me personally, I feel this idea around BIM data just adds to the confusion. The other one was MBIMs in the US. So this was picked out as probably one of the second ones or most common that were used in South Africa. So one of my other hats is what was the Centre for Digital Britain. So I was an international advisor, advising different governments around the world, and probably the last 4 or 5 years has been with the US, trying to speak to the different sort of factions within the country to help them try and understand what ISO 19650 is and what it could do in the US. So that culminated in a memorandum of understanding between the US and UK. For those of you who've seen the US National BIM Standard, which was published, that was BIM Strategy, which was published last year. So ISO 19650 plays heavily in that strategy, and it will work alongside MBIMs. So if you are using MBIMs and not ISO 19650, I think we are going to start to see a convergence probably the next 3 to 5 years. The other thing to point out is that ISO 19650 isn't the be-all and end-all. All right, there are a range of other standards out there that you will need to adopt in addition to ISO 19650 in order to be able to implement it properly. One of those is ISO 8000, which was published, it was last year. Anyone know what ISO 8000 is? There's plenty of quiz questions throughout today. So that's on data quality, all right? And it picks up things like the fact that you've got MBIMs there, but on the table, there's a rogue I. You put MBIMIS, which is a typo, all right? So that's your data, ISO 8000 would have picked up things like that. Okay, just as a quick introduction, I know Rich has done a quick one, but just as a bit of background for you. So by trade, I'm a military engineer. So I was in the Royal Engineers for just under 10 years. Still probably the most collaborative environment I've ever worked in terms of individuals and teams working together to get the job done. It was only when it came out that I discovered things like profit and contracts and all the other barriers that we face in terms of working together. Since coming out, I probably had a few roles in terms of industry. One of them was probably around with London Underground, where I was there for 5 years. My main role there is to help them improve the way in which they managed and produced information. So London Underground are the largest asset owner in central London. At the time, was 2007, so Crossrail, which was then the largest project in the Northern Hemisphere, was getting underway. They were asking questions of London Underground as the client, really hard questions like, what information do you want? When do you want it? How do you want it? And so my job was to try and help answer some of those questions. And then 2012, so just over 10 years ago, I left London Underground and set up Operam to try and help other organisations to do a similar thing. And we've been quite fortunate to work with large client organisations, both public sector and private sector around the world, helping them to understand what all this means for them too. But there's two sides to the business. One is that advisory side. The other side is the education piece, which is where Operam Academy comes in, where we try and help organisations to build the capability and capacity that they need to manage information more effectively. I know there's quite a few in the room, which have already sort of come up and said hello, but just as a quick show of hands, who's done the Operam Academy training in the room? Okay, I was plenty of customers then, isn't it? Right, perfect. Okay, and then as a sideline, I also work at the British Standards Institute, so I sit on a committee called B555, and we look after all the standards relating to information management within the UK. So as Richard said, I've been involved in the development of the UK 1192 series, which some of you may be familiar with. So I was co-author of PAS 1192 Part 2, which is the framework document for BIM Level 2 in the UK, and the rest of the UK 1192 series. And then in 2014, I was asked to elevate that to ISO and author of Part 2 and some of the transition guidance. And then I've been probably the last 15 years involved in a number of different groups similar to this, mainly in the UK. So I'm a big advocate in what Richard said in terms of this sort of like bottom-up approach, industry working together to actually change the way in which we perform. As an industry, we're still the last sort of big industries to adopt digital, and so there's this huge opportunity for us, as well as demand for the services and assets that we provide. But my latest one is there's an organisation called NEMA, which is based in the UK. Has anybody, quick show of hands, who's heard of NEMA? Okay, a few of you. If you're looking for some resources around information management, some good examples, some practical guidance, then head over to the NEMA website, just search We Are NEMA. And there's a lot of, it's all community-led. There's a lot of information available to you there. So my role with NEMA is as an international ambassador, trying to sort of help sort of spread the word, I guess, around the world. The other thing outside that, so my life isn't just information management. So I do also enjoy doing endurance sports and triathlon. Any other triathletes? One? Probably more than one. Okay, popular sport. Okay, so that's probably more than enough about me. What I'd like to do is just run you through, give you a little quick overview of the ISO 19650 series on the basis that, you know, so we're all on the same page. But I think what I was asked to do is try and give you a bit of a foundation so that we can have a more informed conversation after this session. So, in terms of the series themselves, there are currently 5 parts that have been published. Part 1 is looking at the concepts and principles for the management of information throughout the entire asset lifecycle. So what we did is we took the concepts and principles, for those of you who remember, from BS 1192, PAS 1192 Part 2 and PAS 1192 Part 3, and we can combine them into Part 1 of the ISO 19650 series. So if you're new to information management, then Part 1 is a really good place for you to start. Part 2, which obviously is one of the for me, the best out of the 5, is looking at the management of information throughout the delivery phase of assets. All right, so that's from the project inception to cutting the ribbon, and then also handing that over to the client. And that's, I think, where most of you are familiar with in terms of that information management process. Okay, in terms of the one that you can see around the room. Part 3 is looking at the management of information through the operational phase of assets. Now, this is mainly aimed towards the asset owners, operators, and maintainers. Although it's part 3, that's really a legacy because we did PAS 1192 part 3 after we did part 2. And that was only because we knew more about the delivery phase than we did the operational phase. Part 3 is actually the prequel to part 2. Right? So if you're a client, asset owner, operator, or maintainer, then part 3 is your starting point. Just as a quick show of the room, who would consider themselves to be an asset owner, operator, or maintainer? Okay, that's not a bad number if I'm being honest. Okay, normally there's like 1 or 2 in these events. So well done for coming along. So yeah, so that's your starting point. That's your in to the information manager process. Part 4 is starting to look at the exchange of information between the different parties, predominantly the delivery teams and the clients, and helps to facilitate that in terms of making that go as smoothly as possible. And then part 5, it looks at adopting what we refer to as a security-minded approach to the manager of information. Right? It is not about information security, which is where a lot of people get confused. All right, so information security is ISO 27000. Yeah, perfect. All right. So ISO 27000 is your information security. So that looks after all your sort of firewalls, antivirus, and all that nonsense. This is about understanding. Within it, you'll find a triage process. All right. The triage process helps you to identify if you've got any in part or whole assets that are deemed to be sensitive. Okay, so if you're a client and you're owning any sort of critical national infrastructure, then part 5 is relevant. If you're working on any job that is part of critical national infrastructure or any assets that are deemed sensitive, then part 5 is for you as well. All right. Within it, it helps you to identify what those assets are and to any additional measures that may need to be put in place in order to manage the information associated to sensitive assets more effectively. Okay, that was a very quick run through in terms of the different 5 parts. If you're sat there thinking only 5, we want more, all right, you'd be pleased to know that part 6, all right, is in development and will hopefully be published this year. So that's going to be based on PAS 1192 part 6, which looked at the support for health and safety. So being able to include risk information, health and safety information within the information model, rather than put it in a file, in a box, on a shelf somewhere. Okay, so that will hopefully be out later this year. And we're going with this now. Okay, and another thing to note, sort of hot off the press. So a couple of weeks ago, we got there was a vote with the ISO community as to whether the parts 1 and 2 should be reviewed as part of the 5-year cycle. That vote was positive. So we're about to start a new work item to review parts 1 and 2. As part of that, we've also put in an application to combine the review with part 3. So we're hoping to review parts 1, 2, and 3 within the next 18 months to 2 years. And a few of us, including myself, are advocates of trying to combine the processes within parts 2 and 3, which is what we've actually done. So the process that you can see around the room is actually a combined process of parts 2 and 3, and hopefully that will get through. We can get that through the ISO process. Okay, so that's the standards out of the way. And as I say, when we refer to information management, we tend to refer to it as ISO 19650. So you'll see that in some of your contracts. Any strategies or mandates that you're looking to do will be ISO 19650 series. If there's one thing that I'd like you to take away from the time that you're spending here today, it is this. It's to forget about ISO 19650. Right? It is just a set of standards. Nobody really cares about them. Nobody really cares about what number they are or even remembers what number they are. Okay? What I'd like you to do is forget about them as a series of standards. What I'd encourage you to do is to think about information management as a process, not as a series of standards. The information management process, as defined within ISO 19650, has 8 steps. We're going to go through each of the steps in total, but basically, like any process, it's a set of interrelated activities that convert inputs into outputs. for an intended purpose. And that intended purpose is for the right people to get the right information at the right time. And that's it. Okay? So information management is a process. And then if you look at each of the steps within it, you'll see there are a number of activities. Right? Some can be done in parallel, so they're the ones stacked on top of each other. But some of them are dependent on outputs from the preceding activity. So they need to be done in linear. Okay? To the point where you can't really do the activity until you get the output from the preceding activity. All right? So it's very much interdependent, and there is a sequence to how these activities are done. And you can't really pick and choose which activities you want to do either, right? Because ultimately, each activity is dependent on outputs from the preceding activities. And so if you look through each of the steps, what you'll see is it starts to lay out in terms of the order in which these activities need to be undertaken. In fact, the activities must be undertaken. So when I think of information management, this is what I think of. Right? I don't think of it as 5 parts of a standard, which is actually a bit of a lie, because when you look at the process like this, it does look and appear to be a linear process. At this point is where everyone tries to think, that looks a little bit like the project management process. And I wonder if I could line the project management process alongside it. All right, and the answer is you can't. The reason for that is because steps 2 to 7 are repeated for each and every appointment on that project. Okay, so if you had 3 appointments on a project, then this is what the information management process looks like. All right, so it's not a linear process, all right, and it doesn't align with any project management processes which are linear. Okay, so in doing that, where are we now? Come through. So I'm just going to address the elephant in the room in terms of this BIM thing. I know this is quite contentious, all right? But for me, this is where BIM sits in the process, all right? So you'll notice step 6 is the collaborative production of information, right? Where did we first hear the term collaborative production of information? There's double points for this one. No? Okay, it was the BS 1192, which was first published in 2007. So this is not a new thing, all right? But BS 1192 was a standard which looked at how individuals and teams could work collaboratively within a shared repository known as accommodating environment. You just need to get warmed up, don't you? Okay, so, and the concepts and principles of BS 1192 have remained almost intact and survived what is coming up to close to 20 odd years, okay? And that is what step 6 of the information management process is, all right? So, as I say, I know that's quite contentious, but that, for me, is where it sits. And so in terms of the title, information management when using BIM, that's what it means. When you're doing that bit, this is how you need to manage information. And I think where we've fallen down as an industry is that we focused in on this bit, because this is the bit that we like, this is the bit that we know and what we have. And so we've changed the tools that we use, and we've changed the way in which we produce information. But what we haven't done is changed how we manage it. And that is where ISO 19650 comes in. Okay, so we've got our process, we've got our steps, we've got our activities, but who is responsible for doing those? So as you can see, there are quite a lot of activities on there. And so what we needed to do is a way in which we could, within the standard, identify who was responsible for doing what. And so we came up with a concept around parties and teams. So in terms of parties, we've got appointing party, lead appointed party, and appointed party, which I know is a bit of a mouthful and no one really likes, all right? But you try and find a term that every country on the planet will agree to, all right? And you'll find that's not that easy, all right? But there's a way around this, all right? And I'll come onto that when we talk about the national annex. So there are parties. We've then got a number of teams. We've got project team, delivery team, and task teams. And that just helps us to group the different parties together, okay? So this is the diagram that if you actually read, for those of you who got it and didn't read it, if you did read it, you will see this diagram. And we've intentionally not made it as a hierarchical diagram. But what we did do is we made sure that the appointing party, all right, which is generally either your owner, the client, or the employer, depending on where you're from, is at the center of the process, all right, because they are key to everything. So we've got our appointing party, and there is only one. By definition, they are the entity commissioning and financing the project. Okay, so that could be an asset owner, it could be a developer. Whoever's commissioning and financing that project are deemed to be the appointing party. We then have our appointed parties, and these are the parties that are appointed to ultimately produce the information on behalf of the appointing party. Now, one of those appointed parties will be a lead appointed party, and a lead appointed party is an appointed party which is a direct appointment with the appointing party. I still don't know why everyone finds it so confusing. Okay, so one of the appointed parties will be the lead appointed party. And generally, people associate this with the lead designer, lead constructor, lead contractor, whatever it might be, but it doesn't have to be. So even if, as Operam, as a micro business, if we're on the project and we're appointed, then by default, so if you look at in terms of this one over here, have I got this way? No, that's not going to work, is it? Oh, it does, yeah. So this here, this could be Operam, all right? So we're just a small team, but by default, we are also the appointed and the lead appointed party because we have a direct appointment with the appointing party. So don't think of it as, well, you've got to be this huge multinational organization. It's simply by defined as an appointed party with a direct appointment with the appointing party. Okay, so there are parties. I then got our task teams. Now, again, a lot of people think that a task team equates to an appointed party. The reality of it is that an appointed party can belong to more than one task team, and a task team can be made up of more than one appointed party. The problem is, you try and display that on this graphic, and it becomes quite complicated and messy, all right? But, so it is simplified, all right, but that is the reality of it in terms of it's not a one-to-one relationship with the task teams. Next, we've got our delivery teams. So our delivery team is all of the task teams, all the appointed parties, and the lead appointed party, all right? And this is probably generally where a lot of you would work in a delivery team, but often would refer to it as a project team. It's your project, but it's not the project, right? You're just a delivery team with an appointment on the project. Because in terms of the ISO, and just generally, the project is all of the delivery teams and the appointing party, okay? Now, this is important because when we use the word project, you'll notice a lot of the activities and a lot of the outputs from the process are prefixed with the term project. So you've got things like the project's information standard, the project's common data environment, the project's information production methods and procedures. If it's prefixed with the term project, it means that everybody has to sign up to it. Okay? So anything prefixed with project is everybody, all delivery teams and the appointing party. If it begins with delivery team, so like the delivery team's BIM execution plan, then that is specific to delivery team. All right, so just be mindful of that. So we've got our parties, we've got our teams, and then the arrows are significant. So we've got bi-directional arrows. And what this is there to represent is that the requirements for information disseminate from the center, so from the appointing party, via the lead appointed, to the appointed parties via the lead appointed party. The appointed parties then produce the information, and then that is exchanged back up to the appointing party via the lead appointed party. Okay? And then you also have exchanges of information and coordination between delivery teams. So you might be on a multidisciplinary project, or there might be different phases of a project. Okay? Now, what you'll see is there's no contractual route between the different lead appointed parties. And again, that is why the client, owner, appointing party is so important, right? Because they facilitate the coordination of information between the different delivery teams. So when we talk about the collaborative production of information, this is what we're referring to. Okay, we're talking about the different parties, the different teams, the flow of requirements information to the appointed parties, and then the exchange of information back up and coordination between the different delivery teams. If you're not doing this, then you're just doing the production of information, right? But what we're trying to do is the collaborative production of information, which is this. Okay, so who is responsible for what? So what we've done at Operam Academy is we've just added some color coding. So we've got the dark color is the appointing party, dark blue, the lead appointed parties, and the light blue, which isn't really coming out very well on the screen, as the appointed parties. All right, so we've got our three parties. To save you counting, you'll see the lead appointing party, the client, the owner, is responsible for 26 of the activities. Lead appointed parties, 18, and appointed parties, just 6. Okay, and most of those relate to the production of information. So hands up who would regard themselves as a sort of a small to medium-sized project, team or company. Okay, a few of you. So again, I can appreciate a lot of this can be a little bit overwhelming, particularly for the smaller organizations, but ultimately, most of these activities are stuff that you already do. All right, so there's not a huge amount for you to take away or learn or invest in from this. So what does that mean? Well, essentially what it means is that the appointing party, the client, the owner, is actually responsible for over 50% of the activities within the information management process. And not only that, they are by far the biggest activities. If you just, like one of these is identify your asset information requirements. There are organizations, asset owners, 2-3 years in to doing that one activity, all right? So it's quite a significant amount of effort in terms of the for the clients and the appointing parties. Lead appointed parties, 36%, all right, because you're directly involved with you're sort of sandwiched in the middle, working with the appointing party, but also with the appointed parties. The other thing to know is that an appointed party doesn't have to be an external company, all right? The other reason why we've used appointed and appointing and so on is to try and move away from this idea that if you've got an internal team, then you don't have to do any of this, all right? So an appointment can either be a contract or an internal work instruction. So that if you're a large multidisciplinary organization or one of the largest in South Africa, and you've got a lot of internal teams, you're making internal appointments, right? And your teams are appointed parties. It doesn't have to be a contract and an external. And the appointed parties, just around 12%. So you can see there's a big shit, the vast majority of the heavy lifting is done by the client, and nearly all of it is done at the start. So as I said at the beginning, the process is as a set of interrelated activities, and you need the outputs from the preceding activities to undertake the subsequent downstream activities. So if the client or the appointing party hasn't done any of this, and they've just said, we want BIM, then it's very difficult for the delivery teams to then undertake to do what they need to do as part of the information management process. They can still do stuff, they will still get some benefit, but I can guarantee you will not achieve the outcomes that you're looking for in terms of the information management process. And just in terms of the strategies, because I know there's conversations around proposal around some mandate or some within South Africa. In 2011, the UK government published the government construction strategy. Within that, there was about 12 strategic objectives, one of which was to implement BIM level 2 by 2016. All right, so some of you may be familiar with this. So everyone called this the BIM mandate. And everyone thought, right, this is the government telling the supply chain, you've got to now go away and do this. All right. It was the complete opposite. All right, so I was involved in the preceding work before that and advising in terms of what could go into the strategy, which is why we ended up with this sort of level 2 by 2016, because we felt that was achievable. What was saying is that the government as a client, which in the UK makes up 40% of the construction spend, will procure assets in accordance with BIM level 2, as it was called at the time, which just meant that we will do all this. That's what they were committing to. There was nothing on there was no mandate for the supply chain. The mandate was for the government departments to improve the way in which they went out and procured information about their assets. Right, so there is a big difference around that. Happy to have a conversation around it, but if you're like a lot of countries who are looking for mandates, the mandate is an internal one, not one on the supply chain. Okay, so what do the activities look like? So within it, each activity is defined in a very similar way. Basically, it says somebody shall do something. Now, the word shall is important because ISO 19650 Part 2 is what we call a specification. So it's the highest tier of standard that you can get. Below that, you have a code of practice, which uses the modal verb should. And then below that, you have guidelines. All right. So somebody shall do something. So in this case, it's the appointing party shall establish some information production methods and procedures. To make the standard scalable so that it can apply to a small bus shelter all the way up to a giga project, we introduced the term shall consider. So for nearly, I'd say probably 80% of the clauses, you will see a shall consider, and that's what gives it its scalability. On the basis that so long as you consider what is below, if it doesn't apply, you can forget about it, all right? But if asked, you can demonstrate that you've considered it. If it does apply, then you have to do it. Now, for those who see probably the clients as well, they're probably thinking, how the hell, we haven't got the capability or capacity to do any of that, all right? But again, we've allowed for that within the standards. So within it, you've got two options. You can either employ a third party to undertake the activity on your behalf, right? And that's where myself and Operam generally come into play. So we would be engaged by the client to sit next to them to do some of these things on their behalf. Or you can discharge your responsibility to an appointed party. Right? So there's no reason why any organization, big, small, or indifferent, can't undertake their responsibilities. So you've got those two options within it. And Table A or Annex A within ISO 19650 Part 2, which is the Information Management Responsibility Assignment Matrix, it provides you with a template, right? And you can expand that. So you can either undertake it yourself, employ a third party, discharge to an appointed party, or some of these are actually relevant to the lead appointed party. Just as a word of caution now, if you are going to do this, and this was your project team, I would avoid using any of these lead appointed parties. Okay, so when you're acting on behalf of the client, then you need to be able to go into these organizations and explain what they need to do, be it unbiased, right? But if you've got commercial interest in the project, then it starts to get a little bit more complicated. Okay, so that's where we are in terms of the process. What we're doing now is we'll spend a few moments to go through each of the steps, all right? And I'll pick out some of the key activities within it. Again, this is going to follow on, so later on after the break, you're going to be asked to have a think about what activities you feel South Africa need to consider incorporating within their national annex, all right? So step one looks at the assessment of need. So as you showed before, these activities or this step is done before a client or owner is even thinking about a project. All right. A lot of it is around the requirements for information. So we've got our organizational, asset, and project information requirements. All right. There's the three core types. So all of those need to be established. We've then got ultimately things around the commercial side. So what you're looking to do is to provide the right commercial and collaborative environment for delivery teams to be able to do what they need to do. So in that, once you've got your requirements for information, We've then got things like the project's information standard, production method and procedures, and any of the shared resources that they may need in order to produce that information. We then got establishing the accommodating environment and links to any of the enterprise systems. So this is providing the right collaborative environment for information to be produced. And then from a commercial point of view, we've got things like the information protocol. I'll come on to that shortly. So there's a lot of work in step one, all right, but it only needs to be done once. That's probably the good thing about it. And if the client gets it right, then everything else is going to be pretty much plain sailing, all right? If they don't, the best analogy I can give you is if you were to say, or if I was to ask you to cook me a meal. Well, I'm not going to tell you what food I like or what food I want. I'm not going to get you any ingredients. I'm not even going to give you a kitchen to cook it in. But I'm expecting a meal, right? That's pretty much what happens if the client is going out to procure without undertaking any of these activities within step one. Okay, so once that's out the way, we're now into step two. So remember, steps 2 to 7 are repeated for each and every appointment. All right, so this does have to be repeated. But if they get step 1 nailed, then this is pretty straightforward. So within this, what they're looking to do is in terms of looking at what information is needed for each appointment. So now they're distilling their organizational, asset and project information requirements into a set of contractual requirements, which we refer to as the exchange information requirements. Alongside that, any of the reference information and shared resources that are going to be needed, and the evaluation criteria that they're going to be assessing the teams based on their capability and capacity to provide them the information that they need. Okay, so very much around the procurement teams now within those asset owning organizations. Step 3 is around the tender response, and this is probably where, for most of you, this is where you come into the process. All right, so the invitation to tender has gone out. It's going to vary from we want BIM to an actual an invitation to tender that does include a comprehensive or clear set of exchange information requirements. And the tender response, what you're looking to do is to, as a delivery team, look at what your proposed approach is to meeting the exchange information requirements. So this is really the opportunity for you to innovate, all right, in terms of understanding how you can add value and how you can provide them with the information that they need in the most effective way. All of that good stuff goes into the BIM execution plan. At that point, you then need to assess the capability and capacity of the delivery team to implement the proposed approach. If you've gone all out and said, yeah, we're going to immerse ourselves in a virtual reality world, and we'll be doing fly-throughs, and we've got drones, and we've got AI. If you haven't got the team to deliver that, right, you're going to come unstuck. All right, so you need to balance proposed approach against the capability and capacity of the actual team, not of the organization. All right, you might be awesome in another office or another country, of the team that are going to be delivering that appointment. So we put all that together, and then where there is a gap in terms of capability capacity, we're then expected to prepare a mobilization plan. And the mobilization plan is your commitment to addressing any gaps or shortfall in the capability capacity that you've put to meet your proposed approach. So that could be recruitment, it could be training, it could be new hardware, new software, whatever it might be, all right, that you're committing to that in your mobilization plan. Also, the client wants to see what your understanding of risk in terms of the timely delivery of information. And then you put all that together and you compile that with your overall tender response. All right. So that goes in, and then hopefully you'll be successful. For me, there is a big gap around the evaluation, which hopefully we're going to address in the review. But if you're successful, you'll then be notified that you're the preferred bidder. So in public sector procurement, and I'm not entirely sure if this is the same as South Africa, there is a standstill period, normally of at least 4 weeks, up to normally about 2 to 3 months. That's the period for being notified that you've been successful to do all the detailed planning. All right, so you're doing the detailed planning around the information delivery. So you've got your detailed responsibility matrices, your task information delivery plans, and your master information delivery plans. You're putting all that together, and then all that goes into your the appointments, both between the appointing party and the lead appointed party, and lead appointed party and all their appointed parties. Okay. When we look at the structure of the appointments, so this is a diagram that I did with a lady called May Winfield, who's a lawyer with Borough Happold. What we're trying to do is to graphically represent, albeit there's so many different types of contract out there, what the appointment needs to look like. And the key element is the project information protocol. All right, the protocol is what glues everything together, glues it to the contract. Because if it's not appended to the contract, it doesn't exist. All right, it's just a nice to have or an agreement on a handshake. All right, but when the proverbial hits the fan, all of that just dies away, and it's only what's in the contract. What you'll notice is within that, so you've got the appointing parties exchange information requirements. They should form part of the contract, but also the master information delivery plan. So that is the what in terms of exchange information requirements, and the when in terms of the master information delivery plan. For the how, we've got the project information standard. Okay, notice the prefix project. That means that every delivery team needs to comply with that, and delivery team BIM execution plan. So this is specific to the delivery team. But they also need to be appended to the main body of the contract via the project information protocol. And then we've got a series of reference information that sits below that. Okay, if you haven't got that, if you haven't got your these outputs appended to the contract, then as I say, they just don't exist. Right? In terms of the appointments between the lead appointed party and the appointed parties, bearing in mind that could be a contract or it could be an internal work instruction, everything is exactly the same apart from they will have the lead appointed parties exchange information requirements, which would be the bit that they have to deliver, and they have their own task information delivery plan. All right, so all the task information delivery plans are rolled up into the master information delivery plan, which belongs to the lead appointed party. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea in terms of what we're talking about in terms of that appointment. Moving on, so you've been awarded the contract, all the appointments are going. So at this point, all anybody wants to do is crack on and start producing the information, right? What we found is that's probably the worst thing that you can do, right? What I would encourage you all in terms of step 5 is the mobilization step, right? And this is where you're ensuring that everybody in the delivery team understands and knows what information they need to produce, when they need to produce it, and how they need to produce it. Don't forget, back in the tender stage, you committed, within your mobilization plan, you committed to filling up any shortfall around capability and capacity. Now is the time to implement that. So it could be recruitment, it could be training, education, co-locating if it's a joint venture, all right? So all that stuff happens, and then you then start to move into the production of information. You'll see there's 3 levels here, so this is just to represent 3 different task teams to show the collaborative production of information, where they're producing different containers, and then all those come together as an information model. And then there's a cycle around that until the information hits the required level of information need for that information delivery milestone. And at that point, it is then handed over or exchanged, authorised by the lead appointed party, and then hopefully reviewed and accepted by the appointing party. Now, there is a preconception that this only happens at the end of the stage, end of the project stage. It happens for each and every information delivery milestone, which may be multiple within that information delivery stage. The other thing to point out is the information model. Now, what we mean by information model is certainly not BIM data, but there's 3 elements to the information model. One is the graphical representation in the form of geometrical models. It can be 2D, 3D, or 1D if you've got spatial data. Also, asset data. So this is about the form and functionality of the different assets. And there's, as much as we love to, we're going to be stuck with some documentation at some point. So that's all your drawings, reports, photographs, all that stuff. Anything that's a point in time is referred to as a documentation. So that's the information model. That's what gets handed over. All right? So it's not just a PDF. All right? It's around the data, the geometrical models, and the documentation. In terms of the collaborative production of information, sorry, it's a step. That, in terms of the production of information, obviously you're going to need some enabling technologies to do that. All right. So this is your, for all the geeks out there, this is your 2 minutes. Enjoy it. All right. So this coincides with, again, the white paper that was done. So I was interested to see this. Obviously, there was a range of different tools within that survey. I think these were pre-selected for the report, and then everybody responded in terms of the point at which they use that. Most of these are production tools. So if you look at the activities within step 6, generate, acquire, check, review, approve, authorize, and accept, a lot of these tools will help you with that. There's ProjectWise and BIM 360 or Construct Cloud. Yeah, one of those was highlighted as being. So these generally what we refer to, or what people refer to as common data environments. All right. What I'm going to tell you is that for me they are not common data environments. Now the reason for that is because we refer to it as the project's common data environment solution. Because if you think of the different types of information within that information model, there is no one system out there that can manage all the different types of information that you need to produce relating to the assets. So a CD solution will include document management systems, geospatial information systems, relational databases, and engineering management systems. Right? So it's going to be a collective of different systems. And even at that point, it's still not a common data environment. It only becomes a common data environment when all those different systems are integrated. Right? That's what makes it common. Right? Not only that, once you've got your common data environment, you then start to plug in your data acquisition systems. All right? So I'm not going to go down the whole digital twin route. All right? I know there's probably a few of you going like, go on, please. No. But if you want to go for digital twin and you're looking to link the physical to the virtual, then you need to work out how you're going to do that. So you'll plug in your different data acquisition systems into CDE, and then also link out to the different enterprise business systems. All right? So there's a lot to it. You can't just, this is not something you can just go out and buy. All right? Let's set up over the weekend and let's crack on. All right? And this is why it's for the appointing party and the client, the responsibility for providing this to the delivery teams. Okay, 2 minutes are over. Oh, we're almost, right? Within that as well, for it to be a common data environment, it also needs to support the workflow. All right? Now, the workflow is designed to support the collaborative production of information. I'm not going to go into this, but there are a number of what we refer to as workflow states or container states. So you've got your work in progress, shared, published, and archived. If you look at the bottom, the transition, so the transition between work in progress and shared, you've got your check, review, and approve. So they are the first 3 or 4 activities within step 6. And then between shared and published, you've got your review, authorize, and accept, which is step 7. All right, so that is how it dovetails into the information management process. This is the workflow that supports that process. If your common data environment, what you're referring to as a common data environment, can't support this workflow, then you haven't got a common data environment. Okay, I'm going to get off my soapbox now. Right, so that's step 7. The last one is step 8, and that's the closeout and asset information model aggregation. So this is now the appointment has been completed. If you think of it from an asset owner point of view, even in London Underground, I think we had about 150 projects in flight at one time. All of those are delivering information models. And then so what we had to do is then aggregate those to represent the asset information model, which is basically the virtual asset of what was physically out there. So all that goes in there instead of step 8, along with lessons learned, which I'm going to try and get incorporated into all the other steps. But it's basically about how we can actually improve that moving forwards. And then there's a couple of little loop backs in there. So again, another little whistle stop tour through each of the 8 steps. Hopefully, if you didn't already, you now appreciate in terms of how the information management process works, how each of the 8 steps relate to each other, and the different activities within it, and who's responsible for what. Okay, but as I said at the start, what I would implore you to do, or what I hope you're going to do, is to stop thinking of this as a series of standards. All right, this is an information management process, and this is what it looks like. I'm going to shut up now for a bit. But I think we are going to open the floor to some questions around that. Okay, go on, we'll kick off. I think there is a mic, but you just have to speak loudly.
Yeah, it's Andrew from Sanrail, so it's linear infrastructure like you did in underground. Can you just go back 3 or 4? I just want to ask you about those containers at step 6. I'll tell you when to stop. Oh, thanks, Angela. So you had lots and lots of there. So those boxes, the light blue ones, what do you call those?
Well, so each box is an activity. So the light blue, which isn't really showing up very well on here. So this is for the appointed party to do. So here we've got 3 appointed parties or 3 task teams. That's why we've shown them stacked against each other. So let's start off checking that they've got the information that they need. So reference information might be surveys, scans, mapping, whatever it might be, and any shared resources that they need to produce the information. And from there, they'll go on and generate that information. Depending on what type of information it is, will depend very much on what the production method and procedures are to do that. Before they share it, they'll go through, they will check that it's compliant with the project's information standard. And then also somebody with the authority, a competent individual, will review the information within the container and approve it and will assign it a suitability for which the information within the container can be used. At that point, it is then shared and available to the other task teams for them to be able to coordinate for the information model.
Okay, so if I can just deflect it to Richard. Richard? I'm just thinking that those bottom 4 boxes might be topographical survey on a typical Sanrail job. So our projects don't start without LiDAR survey, 50 kilometers of road, half a kilometer wide. I'm thinking until such time as, if we take topo survey as a topic, until such time as that's decent, we can't start the design process. Roads and bridges.
Yeah. No, I hear what you're saying. So for that, so typically that would only involve 1 appointed party. So what you would do is you remove these 2. So that the steps 2 to 5 would be identical. You're just going out to commission a LiDAR survey, all right? But again, the same thing happens here. So even with the LiDAR, and when they're post-processing that, whether it either be a point cloud or whatever format that you've asked it for it to be in, they will need some form of shared resources. This generate changes to acquire, all right, because there's different processes behind acquiring information than there is to generating it. So generate we tend to use for new information about assets that don't exist. Acquire is about getting information about assets that do exist. And I'm assuming that probably about 90% of your assets are already in use at the moment. So most of this is a key part of your work. So they go out, they check that, they acquire the information. They will still need to check, because I'm assuming you've got some information standards that you want them to do, whether that's units, global origin, coordinate system. They're going to check that it's all coordinated, and then they're going to approve that. Generally, for the suitability, if you've gone out and paid for a survey, they'll be doing that for coordination. So they'll approve that for the suitability of coordination, at which point then, that will then be published. You can then distribute that to the other delivery teams here as reference information, with the suitability for coordination.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm Bernd Ullerman from the CSR. I'm not sure whether it's implicit, but verification of the information and the model, and then also monitoring and evaluation of this whole process. Where does that fit in?
Okay, so in terms of the verification, so the project information model, which is generally the output through the delivery phase, the first iteration is known as the design intent model. So that's typically what the design teams will be putting together. So from the design intent model, that is then the second iteration is known as the virtual construction model. So the virtual construction model starts off as what you'd probably know as the detailed design. So they go out. So typically the lead contractor or the designer, if it's been novated, will then take the design intent into a detailed design, which is then verified through key stages of construction. Now, increasingly, probably over the last decade, that's done through point cloud survey with looking for delta changes. Now, you can only do that if you've put in the correct tolerances or specified the correct tolerances for the model. Okay, so everything will be produced obviously to a nano millimeter accuracy, and as we all know, we're a little bit off that when it comes to construction. But if the asset is constructed within tolerance, then everything's happy, or everyone's happy. Sorry. If it's out of tolerance, that is when you would then go back to the design team to update the design intent model. I'll give you an example of that. So if you've got quite a large building with quite a large floor area, and you'll put your floor slab in. If you're putting some steel framework on top of that, that steel framework will have been designed on top of a slab that is like a lake or milk pan, whatever you call it. Just as one case study is then, if you then actually survey or scan that slab, you've got an opportunity, depending on your lead time, to go in and modify the structural steel framework design so that you don't end up packing or knocking out when you're actually out on site. So that's just one example of verifying the construction within tolerances against the virtual model. Is that explicit in the thing? It's not, if I'm being honest. But that would come in as part of, because you've got what the standard's looking to do is around information requirements for information. We're stepping into the world of construction management, and what we were very keen to do is to not, because we're surrounded by all these. We've got project management, design management, asset management, construction management, and we just didn't want to sort of step in to each one of those. So for me, verification around that sits in the world of construction management, but the mechanism to do it is fundamentally within the information management process. Yeah.
Sorry, I just have a question around the, where do you start implementing what you need to in a company? So let's say, for example, as an engineering company, let's say that step one, if you go back to step one, basically, that's basically identifying your assessment and need, and generally that needs to come from the client side.
Yeah.
Looking to implement an information standard within your office, where do you start your process? Because obviously assessment and need from a project perspective would come from a client, but where do you as a engineering consultant start looking at your information standards to complement whatever you're going to be getting from the client?
I mean, that is a big question, and it's probably got a big answer to it. The short version would be to start with your own business processes. And what I mean by that is, I would suspect that you're already doing the vast majority of this. All right. So what we're not introducing, there's nothing really new about this process. It's just in a more structured way that's being internationally agreed, so that we've got a unified approach to how we do this thing. So what I would normally advise organizations is, first of all, to understand what your current business processes are. I'm going to hazard a guess. I don't even know who you work for, but I'm going to hazard a guess that you've already got half a dozen ways of doing this in your own organization. Okay, so the first thing for me would be to establish what would you regard as your unified approach today. And that alone is probably the big task, because a lot of organizations really struggle to do that. From that point, you can then do a gap analysis in terms of, okay, well, how different is that to the information management process? And that would be my starting point to say, and I think you'd find it wouldn't be vastly different. Maybe a few different terms, a few little other bits and bobs that you've introduced over time. But at each step of that, you just got to ask yourself why. Why do we do that? Is it because you've always done it, or is it because it's adding value to the process? So that's the key thing to do. The problem is in an ideal world, you would just look after your own camp. But what we're finding a lot of organizations having to do, because of the low levels of maturity with the clients, they're also having to establish almost like a default set of requirements, a default project information standard, a default. So in lieu of getting something from the client, you can say, well, this is our default. This is what we're going to be working to, saying as part of your tender response. And it's a way that's familiar within the organization. So unfortunately, you've got to do your own house, but you've also got to be prepared for when you don't get the outputs from the process as well. So have a default set.
I'm going to call time because I think everyone needs a quick comfort break, but we're only going to break for 6.5 minutes. All right. I was saying to Paul beforehand that this is going to be a little bit like drinking from a fire hydrant, but I think the way you paced it was great. And I think there were quite a few lights that went on in the room. Even Holly was saying she understood it better for the first time. So that was great as a first session. So what we're going to do now is start diving into that extra chapter that the GPT told us about, is what that national annex does and how it works. And then Paul's going to lead us through a bit of an open discussion on that one. So over to you.
Cool. Thanks, Richard. I was actually quite impressed with the ChatGPT definition. I don't even know if mine's going to be any better, to be fair. Okay, so as Richard said, we're just going to talk a little bit more about in terms of implementation at a national level, in terms of what that looks like and the mechanisms that are there as part of ISO, not specifically to ISO 19650, they are just generally how ISO standards work. And speaking around that, I don't want to make too many assumptions, all right? But basically, ISO is an organization where I think 90% of the countries in the world subscribe to, all right? And their purpose really is to try and develop standards that can be internationally agreed on the basis that there's a global economy. Obviously, a lot of organizations now multinational, and it just helps to, if you've got a unified set of standards around the world. The thing with ISO standards per se is that they don't actually exist. Okay, and what I mean by that is that when they're actually published, they're up in the sky somewhere, right? And they only become a standard when they are adopted by a national standards body. So it generally, most of the countries in the world will have a national standards body. So in South Africa, it's SANS. And so far, from what I understand, SANS have adopted ISO 19650 parts 1 and 2. Yeah, and hopefully part 3 is imminent. So what that means is technically 4 and 5 don't really exist within South Africa. And as I mentioned before, 5, particularly if you're working on national critical infrastructure, so I can't remember the gentleman I was speaking to during the break, is involved in the sort of the power network in South Africa. For sure, part 5 is paramount for anyone in terms of the energy sector particularly. So if you're in a country that hasn't adopted the national standards, then they don't exist, is the point that I'm trying to make. In terms of who develops them, as I say, when someone comes up with an idea for a standard, it is proposed, all right, as a work item. That work item then goes out to all the countries, all the members of ISO, and they get asked a question. Do you think this standard is needed? All right, that's the first question. If they say yes, so it goes to a vote. If it's successful, the second question is, do you want to be involved? And they can choose to be a participating member, which means that they're going to provide expertise to the working group to develop the standard, or they can become an observing member. And all that means that they just get a copy of the drafts to vote on, right? Or they can abstain ultimately. So this is ISO TC 59 SC 13. So Technical Committee 59, Steering Committee 13, which is the Steering Committee responsible for ISO 19650. Now, what you'll see is a glaring gape of a hole in the continent of Africa, right? In fact, it was only Egypt who responded, and they wanted to be an observing member. So not only what does this mean? It means that basically you haven't got a seat at the table. Your voice is not being heard, all right? Ultimately in the development of ISO 19650, which for me, based on what I've seen so far, is a shame, right? Because I think the continent itself, and particularly in South Africa, has got a lot to offer and to contribute to the ongoing development of these standards, all right? But that is the first thing that I just wanted to point out, and just in case you weren't aware. Now, in terms of the development side of things, when you're going through this process, the standards themselves are based on the UK 1192 series. So if you're not aware, in the UK, we developed a series of standards based upon BS 1192, and then there's 6 parts after that. So for a standard to become international, it has to be based on something that's been in use for at least 12 months. So the UK 1192 series was used for that. And so when we went through it, there was most of it was applicable to all the members of the working group, all right, in terms of the process and the activities. There were some things within the UK 1192 series which we would still be discussing now, in all honesty. So things like naming conventions, status codes, all the other noise that goes around it. So in order to move forward, what we decided to do was to strip all that out, okay, so that we could create a set of standards that could be agreed internationally, but recognizing that each country, each region would have their own way of making the big book work for the different blocks, if that's what I remember. Okay. And so the mechanism that we adopted was referred to as the national forward and national annex. The poor national forward always gets forgotten about, all right, but it's also quite important as well as the national annex. So the national forward is in ISO 19650 Part 1. And the reason why it's currently in there, and sorry, go back. So what I'm about to show you is the UK's approach to regionalising ISO 19650. So it's not the only way. So at the moment, we've only got a national forward for Part 1. And the reason why we've got in Part 1 is because Part 1 is where all the terms and definitions are defined, all right? So as a bit of a snapshot, what you can see here is we've taken all those horrible terms that you all love. So appointed party, appointing party, and appointment. And we've done the UK equivalent definition, all right? So what does this mean is that for any term within the ISO, because as I say, we were trying to find terms that A, everyone could agree on, and B, when you translated them, they didn't mean mother-in-law or something like that, okay? Which, because the ISOs get translated into every language on the planet as well. So what you can do is you can take any term that you want. So as I say, you've got appointing party, appointed party, BIM execution plan, all right, which I'm not a big fan of. For me, it's about information. It's an information management plan, but that's another story. And then you can choose as a country what you want that to be. So if you want it to be owner, client, or employer, as we do in the UK, then you can do that. Appointed party, supplier, consultant, contractor. And if you want the BIM execution plan to be called the information management plan, then you can do. So what the National Forward does is provides a mapping between defined terms within ISO to colloquial terms that actually resonate and mean something in your country. So what does that mean is that you can then, you don't even have to use appointed party, lead appointed party, or appointing party. You can just use whatever you want in that country, because it'll be mapped within the National Forward within ISO 19650 Part 1. Okay, so that's one example of the use of a national forward, and you can do that for any of the standards that you want to. In terms of national annex, so at the moment we've only got a national annex for Part 2. There's been a fair amount of discussion as to whether we need a national annex for some of the others, but we haven't really got too far with that. But I think most countries are mainly put the national annex into Part 2, which looks at the management of information through the delivery phase. Now, in terms of what we've seen, so it tends to be, rightly or wrongly, and I'm not saying the UK are the best at this, but it tends to be a lot of the Commonwealth countries or current or former Commonwealth countries adopt UK standards verbatim, and they just change the prefix. So there's a lot of positives to that, in the sense that that means that anybody working in those countries effectively only I've got the same way of working. But you don't have to do that. There are some things in the UK National Annex that I'm personally not a big fan of, but obviously we're democratic, so we have to sort of concede and pick our battles. But as a generally other countries, you can either adopt someone else's, or you can create your own from a blank piece of paper, or you can do a hybrid. All right, it's entirely up to you. Now, the thing with the National Annex is that it is informative. So if what I mentioned before about the specification and the modal verb shall, okay, because it's being written as a specification. So the National Annex is around being a code of practice. Now, again, a code of practice generally has to be based upon practice that has been in industry for at least 12 months. It doesn't mean to say, I think you can, if it was completely brand new, you could introduce it, but by definition, a code of practice has to be based on something that's been in use for over 12 months. So anything within the National Annex is informative. And generally what you're trying to do, or the purpose of a National Annex, is to provide clarification around the clauses within the main standard about how that is implemented within that country or region. All right. So you can't introduce anything new. So you couldn't say, all right, we're going to have a step 9 and we're going to do this. All right. You can't do that in National Annex. So everything that you want to add clarification to, you have to hook into one of these activities. Right. So within, so to give you an example, so a clarification in ISO 19650 Part 2, clause 1.2.3 states that somebody shall blah, 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 blah. All right. What you can say, well, in this country, so in South Africa, when doing blah, 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 you should, and then you can put how you want that to be done. So that's generally how the clarifications are written. So as an example, clause 5.1.7c, as you all know, states that the project's common data environment shall enable information containers of the following attributes assigned to it, right? One of which is classification, and that must be in accordance with the framework defined within ISO 12006 Part 2, which, as you all know, is the international standard for the classification of assets in the built environment. So, in what we've done in the UK, so you can say in this country, the classification of information within the information containers should be in accordance with, and in the UK implementation of ISO 12006 Part 2 is known as Uniclass. The US implementation of 12006 Part 2 is called Omniclass. Okay, so you can get to see, so the requirement says it has to be classified in accordance with a standard, and then in the annex, you can then specify which of those. So you can go with Uniclass, you could go with Omniclass, there's others like coins, there's a few other bits and bobs out there, or if there's one in South Africa or Africa, then you might want to adopt that. But that gives you an example of how to write one of the clarifications. So it has to be a clause within, or one of the activities within the process. In terms of the UK National Annex to Part 2, at the moment, there are 5 areas that we've sort of focused on. Generally, what we try to do is we didn't want to try and change too much too soon. So basically, it was basically the leftovers from BS 1192, right? The stuff that we couldn't get agreed internationally. So we've got information container identification, field codification, container metadata, information model exchange, and project information requirements. So in terms of the information container ID, so this is, you might notice as file naming convention, or what's basically how you identify or uniquely identify containers within the common data environment. Personally, I'm not a big fan of this convention or any convention. Long story, as a bit of a backstory, basically this is a legacy way of trying to accommodate file-based document management systems, right? For me, by having a requirement that all containers must have metadata, if you're using a solution that can't handle metadata, then it can't even be a common data environment contender. So I'd rather move forward than trying to provide legacy mechanisms for information to be exchanged outside the common data environment. Because if it leaves the common data environment, it is uncontrolled, right? And it should never come back. So anyway, so that's the convention as it is in the UK. But you can, as I say, you can come up with any convention if you choose to do so. So the clause that we've picked up on here is around the container naming convention. In terms of the field codification, so each of those fields, all right, project, originator, form, discipline, we've actually specified the fields that can be used within each of those. So the codes that can be used within each of those fields. So in terms of the form, we've got D, G, I, L, M, and T, which comes up with the different types of information. Okay, so they're the codes that that must be used in the UK. Now, the thing with the codes is that what you can't do is you can't change them, but you can add to them. So if you wanted to add another code or a particular type of information, in theory you could, as long as it was defined within the project's information standard. In terms of the container metadata, so one of the fields or pieces of metadata that should be attached to every container is status. So we've identified a series of codes to identify the suitability for which information within the container can be used. All right, so you might be come across these S0, S1, S2, S3, S4, and so on. I'd say you can add additional ones if you want to, but you can't change or those that are being defined within the standard. So we've also defined some codification for the metadata as well. All of this just helps in terms of the exchange of information, because if you've got, you know, if we're saying suitability S2 and another delivery team uses, I don't know, Q5, then you're not going to have that thing. Ultimately, it comes down to the project's information standard, all right, in terms of what. So if you're a client and you have a legacy set of codes, then you put that in the project's information standard, and that overrides the national annex, which is why it uses the word should. If it was shall, then you couldn't override it. All right, so you can still potentially override it if you've got legacy systems in place. The information model exchange. So what we tried to do here was to highlight the fact that an information model is made up of 3 different elements. So we've got geometrical, alphanumerical, and documentation, but also try and signpost towards open data standards as a preference. And this is largely because a lot of clients didn't know how to actually specify the format for information that they needed. So worst comes to worst, if they specify BS-EN ISO 19650 Part 2, which is the equivalent to your SANS 19650 Part 2, then at least here, as the code of practice, open data formats should be used. The alphanumerical is structured within BS 1192 Part 4. So that is the UK implementation of COBE, which stands for Construction Operations Building Information Exchange, which is based on a US standard. All right, so that's the UK anglicized version of COBE, all right, documented in. So that provides a schema for that. So there's things like that. Again, you might want to think about what that would look like in terms of South Africa. Open data standards, I don't know if they're common in use or there's any sort of aspirations to sort of move away from proprietary file formats, then that might be one that you might want to think about. And then in terms of the project's information requirements, so again, every country has got its own project management methodology. The main point here is the BS 8536. So that's actually, well, they're actually being superseded now. So we've just got BS 8536, which we've combined parts 1 and 2 to a single standard. But within that, so that looks for design. 8536 is about design for operation. it specifies the stages of the asset life cycle. So what we've done there is to say, okay, well, whenever you're defining your project information requirements, you need to define them in accordance with the asset lifecycle stages defined within BS A536. All right. And in that way, we haven't got different people talking cross purposes. Everything should be mapped to that. So when we did that, we actually went out to all the professional bodies. And I know that I've spoken to a few people already representing different professional bodies. And we said, right, you all need to align or map your project management methodologies to this. And the Royal Institute of British Architects, or RIBA, as you may know, is probably one of the most common used in the UK as well. To be fair, we all thought, including myself, they would be the last people to come to the table. Well, it turned out they were the first professional body to map their project stages to this. So fair play to the RIBA. Anyway, so that's in there. So as I say, we haven't really done a huge amount in terms of the UK national annex. It was everything that we left out or we couldn't get into the ISO, basically. But we have got, there's as part of Beach Travel 5, which is the mirror committee in the BSI, there are discussions about what we may need. And as part of this review, some of it will go into standards, some of it will drop out and form into the national annex. But I do feel in terms of, again, given that scalability, there are countries like yourselves who have adopted the standards as they are without producing national annexes. But I do feel in certain countries, and from my understanding in terms of South Africa, I'm not saying by you're special in any way, shape or form, but I do recognise that there are some commercial factors, particularly about how you actually go out and procure and how you put teams together, that might need some clarification around how 19650 could be applied within the country. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a better understanding, at least, than when you arrived, about what you can and can't do with the national forward and the national annex. I think we will do, in terms of the journey, because all I can tell you about is how you do it from ISO. There's obviously a journey to get from this point now to getting SANS ISO 19650 Part 2 National Annex. So I'm going to hand over. I've dropped Rudd in it